In this video, we want to get into more details on the heart, and here are our learning objectives. We wanted to divide the heart into the right and left side and describe the two pumps of the heart. We want to talk about what they do. We want to look at the four important valves in the heart, as well as this thing called the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit, and be comfortable answering this particular question in terms of which chamber is the strongest. So when you look at the heart, the heart can be divided into the right side as well as the left side, and so we think of it as two pumps, the right-sided pump and the left-sided pump. So the right-sided pump receives blood from the rest of the body, and it pumps that blood toward the lungs. The left-sided pump then receives blood from the lungs, and then it pumps blood toward the rest of the body, and then the cycle continues. So functionally, we look at it like this. So what I have here, this is the right side of the heart, and this is the left side of the heart. We have names for these chambers, and we describe the heart as being four-chambered. And so this is the right atrium, this is the right ventricle. This is the left atrium and the left ventricle. We can kind of casually describe the difference between atria and ventricles as the atria will receive blood and then the ventricles will pump it out. That's kind of a very loosey-goosey way of describing the difference between these guys. Nonetheless, what I'm saying is that blood will come into the right atrium from where? From the rest of the body, because the right-sided pump receives blood from the rest of the body and it pumps it toward the lungs. So that means blood enters into the right atrium, then goes to the right ventricle, which then pumps it out to the lungs. From there, from the lungs, blood returns to the left atrium, then goes to the left ventricle, in which case it pumps it out to the rest of the body. The right-sided pump then handles deoxygenated blood, and left-sided pump or left-sided heart handles deoxygenated blood. And that's why here I'm just going to use the convention blue to indicate deoxygenated stuff and red to indicate oxygenated stuff. And so this means oxygen poor in blue, and this means oxygen rich. So keep in mind that what the heart really is doing here, the heart is pumping blood out to the lungs so that the lungs can recharge it or refill it with oxygen. And then that oxygenated blood returns to the left side of the heart, which then gets pumped out to the rest of the body. The rest of the body then takes out that oxygen, and then the deoxygenated blood returns then to the right heart. All right, so we might, if we expand on our little diagram, we might expand it to look something like this. Here's the right atrium, and it's receiving blood from the rest of the body. Specifically, it's getting blood from these two ginormous pipes, which are the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. We'll see those later, but what those really are, those are the two big giant pipes, veins, that dump into the right atrium, the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. Very simply, the superior vena cava is a big pipe. It's a big vein, essentially, that's receiving blood from everything above the heart. The inferior vena cava then is receiving deoxygenated blood from everything below the heart. The coronary sinus is actually coming from the heart itself. So these are the three pipes that dump into the right atrium. From there, there's a valve right over here, which we haven't named yet. We will. But blood passes from the right atrium through this valve to the right ventricle, then out another valve, which then goes off to the lungs. Now you can see the way I colored this is that this is still blue deoxygenated blood that goes to the lungs. The lungs then dumps in oxygen, and that red, freshly oxygenated blood then returns to the left atrium, which then passes through another valve to the left ventricle, which passes through another valve to go out to the rest of the body. So that body then extracts the oxygen, and depending on where in the body is, that deoxygenated blood will then dump into either inferior vena cava, superior vena cava, or coronary sinus, depending on where in the body we're talking about. So, at the very least, where you should be right now, you should pause the video and make sure that you understand the right side of the heart, left side of the heart, the atria as well as the ventricles, and which side handles oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood. And I guess that's pretty much it for right now. So let's then move on and to add more details to it. What we're going to do is see these little green things. These are the four valves that we care about. Remember, in our learning objectives, we wanted to talk about the two pumps, and then we wanted to name the four important valves. Well, the four important valves can be divided into two and two. The two of them are atrioventricular valves, and two are semilunar valves. So atrioventricular valves, if those sound like a mouthful to you, then keep in mind that it's really just two words, atria and ventricles. So these are the valves in between the atria and the ventricle. So right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. See, these are the valves. They come in two types, or not two types. There's one on the right, one on the left. The one on the right is called the tricuspid valve, and the one on the left is called the bicuspid valve, also known as the mitral valve. Both these names are used quite a bit, so you should be comfortable with both bicuspid valve as well as mitral valve. It's the same thing. The semilunar valves, then, are the valves that separate out the ventricles from wherever you're going next. And in this one over here, we call this the pulmonic valve, also known as the pulmonary valve. And it's called that because it goes out to the lungs. So when you say pulmonary or pulmonic, that's in reference to the lungs. And this valve is called the aortic valve, and the aortic valve because the pipe it goes into is called the aorta. So in any case, you should know the two atrioventricular valves. What is the name of the AV valve? Atrioventricular is AV. What is the name of the AV valve on the right? What is the name of the AV valve on the left? What is the name of the semilunar valve on the right? What is the name of the semilunar valve on the left? Okay? If we look at this picture is looking at the AV valves, and it's showing you, and all I really want you to see here is that these AV valves and semilunar valves are actually made up of flaps of tissue like this. And so this flap of tissue is set up in such a way where these are actually one-way valves. So meaning that when you look at these valves will only open one way like this, if you follow what I'm doing here, and then it'll close. And actually that's true of the semilunar valves as well too. The semilunar valves will open one way to allow stuff to pass, and then it will go ahead and close. Same thing on the left side. So all of these valves are actually one-way valves. And so this is just, the reason I have this here is just to give you guys a sense of this picture. We'll talk more about some of these other terms, so we'll return to these themes, but for now we're really just naming out the anatomy. This right here, these are the semilunar valves. Again, they're also made of different flaps, and here is a semilunar valve that's open, and here's when the valve itself is closed. So when it's open, blood can go, but then when it closes, blood can no longer pass. All right, so now let's talk about some of these, this idea of the circuits. One of our learning objectives then was to identify between, or differentiate between the pulmonary and systemic circuit. And it's actually pretty straightforward. The pulmonary circuit are all those blood vessels involved in carrying blood to the lungs and away from the lungs, as well as the blood vessels within the lungs. We refer to this as a pulmonary circuit because remember, pulmonary means lungs. And so those include blood vessels that are coming from the right ventricle out into the lungs and then coming away from the lungs and returning to the left atrium. What is the systemic circuit then? It's everything else. And so these are the sets of blood vessels that go to your brain and your muscles and your liver and your spleen and your quadriceps and your ankles and your toes and all over the place. Everything else that's not the lungs. And so this pulmonary circuit is where we dump off carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen. We'll look at those details in the respiratory system. And the systemic circuit is where we dump off oxygen to our tissues and pick up CO2 as waste from our tissues to return that back to the right side of the heart. Now, if you look at this image of the right atrium, you'll see there's two vena cava here, and one would be the superior vena cava, one is the inferior vena cava. And again, this is just kind of a drawing to give you an idea. This is not actually how things look, of course. All right, now let's see. Let's answer the question. Which chamber is the strongest? So there are muscles. So each of these things, and each of the chambers of the heart, there are muscles in there, and there's a sense where each chamber is able to generate a pressure gradient to promote the movement of blood forward. So my question then is, which one do you think, and again, before I give you the answer, I'd encourage you to pause the video, which chamber do you think needs to be the strongest, needs to have the thickest amount of muscle to generate the most force to increase the pressure the most? And one way to figure that out is you could say, well, the right atrium, how far does it need to move blood? Well, it only needs to move blood from the right atrium into the right ventricle, a few inches. The right ventricle, how far does he need to move blood? Well, if you know where the heart is positioned in the mediastinum and know where the lungs are as well, you'd say, well, really, again, not that far. Maybe a handful of inches, maybe a foot, something like that, to get from my right ventricle into different parts of my lungs. And then what about the left atrium? Where does he have to push blood to? To the left ventricle. Fine. Again, not very far, a couple of inches. Left ventricle, where does he need to pump blood out to? The body? Well, from the heart, which you know where it is in the mediastinum, all the way down to your left pinky, your right thumb, the top of the head. It needs to pump it all over the place. So with that in mind, you might guess that, the left ventricle itself needs to generate the greatest amount of force, and you'd be correct in that. So therefore, we know that the left ventricle, if you look at this, I asked the question, why is the left ventricle thicker than the right ventricle? And it's because you need to generate a lot more pressure here in the left ventricle to push blood out to the rest of the body compared to the right ventricle, which only needs to push it out to the lungs. And this is, if you take a look at this kind of horizontal cut, you can see that again. Here's the left ventricle and here's the right ventricle. Okay. All right, let's recap. Describe the two pumps of the heart and the four chambers. Well, the right side of the heart receives blood from the rest of the body and pumps blood towards the lungs, and the left side receives blood from the lungs and pumps blood toward the rest of the body. And the right side handles deoxygenated blood, left side handles oxygenated blood. You should know the two AV valves as well as the two semilunar valves. You know the pulmonary circuit are all those blood vessels that go off to the lungs, and systemic circuit are all those blood vessels that go out to the rest of the body. And then the left ventricle itself is the strongest. And so that's a good place to stop this video, and we'll pick up with more information, and we'll name a little bit more in terms of the named blood vessels that emerge then from the heart.